As president, Eisenhower adopted a style of leadership that emphasized the delegation of authority. He filled his cabinet with successful corporate executives who gave his administration a business-like tone. His Secretary of Defense, for example, was Charles Wilson, the former head of General Motors. Eisenhower was often criticized by the press for spending too much time golfing and fishing and perhaps entrusting important decisions to others. However, later research showed that behind the scenes, Eisenhower was in charge. At 43, Kennedy was the youngest candidate ever to be elected president. His energy and sharp wit gave him a new personal style to the presidency. In his inaugural address, Kennedy spoke of the torch being passed to a new generation and promised to lead the nation into a new frontier. The Democratic president surrounded himself with both business executives such as Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and academics such as economist John Kenneth Galbraith. For the sensitive position of Attorney General, the president chose his younger brother, Robert. John Kennedy and his wife, Jackie, brought style, glamour, and an appreciation of the arts to the White House. The press loved Kennedy's new conferences, and some later likened his administration to the mythical kingdom of Camelot and the court of King Arthur, the subject of a then very popular Broadway musical. Let's take a look at Eisenhower and Kennedy's domestic policies and dealings. Eisenhower was a fiscal conservative whose first priority was balancing the budget after years of deficit spending. Although his annual budgets were not always balanced, he came closer to curbing federal spending than any of his successors. As a moderate on domestic issues, he accepted most of the New Deal programs as a reality of modern life and even extended some of them. During Eisenhower's 2 terms in office, Social Security was extended to 10 million more citizens. The minimum wage was raised and additional public housing was built. In 1953, Eisenhower consolidated welfare programs by creating the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. For farmers, a soil bank program was initiated as means of reducing farm production and thereby increasing farm income. On the other hand, Eisenhower opposed the ideas of federal health care insurance and federal aid to education. As the first Republican president since Hoover, Eisenhower called his balanced and moderate approach modern republicanism. His critics called it the bland leading the bland. The most permanent legacy of the Eisenhower years was the passage in 1956 of the Highway Act, which authorized the construction of 42,000 miles of interstate highways linking all the nation's major cities. When completed, the U.S. highway system became a model for the rest of the world. The justification for new taxes on fuel, tires, and vehicles was to improve national defense. At the same time, the immense public works project created jobs, promoted the trucking industry, accelerated the growth of the suburbs, and contributed to a more homogeneous national culture. The emphasis on cars, trucks, and highways, however, hurt the railroads and ultimately the environment. Little attention was paid to public transportation on which the old and the poor depended. Eisenhower's domestic legislation was modest. During his years in office, however, the country enjoyed a steady growth rate with an inflation rate averaging a negligible 1.5%. Although the federal budget had a small surplus only 3 times in 8 years, the deficits fell in relation to the national wealth. For these reasons, some historians rate Eisenhower's economic policies the most successful of any modern presidents. Between 1945 and 1960, the per capita disposable income of Americans more than tripled. By the mid-1950s, the average American family had twice the real income of a comparable family during the boom years of the 1920s. The post-war economy gave Americans the highest standard of living in the world. The promises of the new frontier mentioned earlier proved difficult to keep. Kennedy called for aid to education, federal support of health care, urban renewal, and civil rights, but his domestic programs suffered in Congress. While few of Kennedy's proposals became law during his 1,000-day administration, most were passed later under President Johnson. On economic issues, Kennedy had some success. He took on big steel executives over a price increase that he said was inflationary and achieved a price rollback. In addition, the economy was stimulated by increased spending for defense and space exploration, as the president committed the nation to land on the moon by the end of the decade. While Eisenhower was concentrating on Cold War issues, events with revolutionary significance to race relations were developing within the United States. The baseball player Jackie Robinson had broken the color line in 1947 by being hired by the Brooklyn Dodgers as the first African American to play on a major league team since the 1880s. President Truman integrated the armed forces in 1948 and introduced civil rights legislation in Congress. These were the first well-publicized indications that race relations after World War II were changing. As the 1950s began, however, African Americans in the South were still by law segregated from whites in schools and in most public facilities. They were also kept from voting by poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and intimidation. Social segregation left most of them poorly educated, while economic discrimination kept them in a state of poverty. The origins of the modern civil rights movement can be traced back to the movement of millions of African Americans from the rural South to the urban centers of the South and the North. In the North, African Americans who joined the Democrats during the New Deal had a growing influence in party politics in the 1950s. The Cold War also played an indirect role in changing both government policies and social attitudes. The U.S. reputation for freedom and democracy was competing against communist ideology for the hearts and minds of the people of Africa and Asia. Against this global background, racial segregation and discrimination stood out as glaring wrongs that needed to be corrected. The NAACP had been working through the courts for decades trying to overturn the Supreme Court's 1896 decision, Plessy v. Ferguson, which allowed segregation in separate but equal facilities. In the late 1940s, the NAACP won a series of cases involving higher education. One of the great landmark cases in Supreme Court history was argued in the early 1950s by a team of NAACP lawyers led by Thurgood Marshall. In Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, they argued that segregation of black children in the public schools was unconstitutional because it violated the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection of the laws. In May 1954, the Supreme Court agreed with Marshall and overturned the Plessy case. Writing for a unanimous court, Chief Justice Earl Warren ruled that 1. Separate facilities are inherently unequal and unconstitutional, and 2. School segregation should end with all deliberate speed. Opposition to the Brown decision erupted throughout the South. To start with, 101 members of Congress signed the Southern Manifesto condemning the Supreme Court for a clear abuse of judicial power. States fought the decision several ways, including the temporary closing of the public schools and setting up private schools. The KKK made a comeback, and violence against blacks increased. In Arkansas, in 1956, Governor Orville Faubus used the state's National Guard to prevent 9 African American students from entering Little Rock Central High School, as ordered by a federal court. President Eisenhower then intervened. While the president did not actively support desegregation or the Brown decision, he understood his constitutional duty to uphold federal authority. Eisenhower ordered federal troops to stand guard in Little Rock and protect black students. Resistance remained stubborn. In 1964, 10 years after the Supreme Court decision, less than 2% of blacks in the South attended integrated schools. In 1962, James Meredith, a young African-American Air Force veteran, attempted to enroll in the University of Mississippi. A federal court guaranteed his rights to attend. Supporting Meredith and the court order, Kennedy sent in 400 federal marshals and 3,000 troops to control mob violence and protect Meredith's right to attend class. A similar incident occurred in Alabama in 1963 when Governor George Wallace tried to stop an African American student from entering the University of Alabama. Once again, President Kennedy sent troops to the scene and the student was admitted. In 1955, as a Montgomery, Alabama bus took on more white passengers, the driver ordered a middle-aged black woman to give up her seat to one of them. Rosa Parks refused, and her arrest for violating the segregation law sparked a massive African-American protest in the form of a boycott of the city buses. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., minister of the Baptist church where the boycott started, soon emerged as the inspirational leader of a nonviolent movement to end segregation. The protest touched off by Rosa Parks and the Montgomery boycott resulted in the Supreme Court ruling that segregation laws were unconstitutional. The boycott also sparked other civil rights protests that reshaped America over the coming decades. Civil rights activists and freedom riders who traveled through the South registering African Americans to vote and integrating public places were met with beatings, bombings, and murder by white extremists. Recognized nationally as the leader of the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. remained committed to nonviolent protests against segregation. In 1963, he and some followers were jailed in Birmingham, Alabama, for what local authorities judged to be an illegal march. The jailing of King, however, proved to be a milestone in the civil rights movement because most Americans believed King to have been jailed unjustly. From his jail cell, King wrote an essay, Letter from Birmingham Jail, in which he argued, "We need emulate neither the do-nothingism of the complacent nor the hatred and despair of the black nationalists. For there is the more excellent way of love and nonviolent protest. I am grateful to God that through the influence of the Negro Church, the way of nonviolence became an integral part of our struggle. One day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for what is best in the American dream and for the most sacred values of our Judeo-Christian heritage, thereby bringing our nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the Founding Fathers in their formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence." King's letter moved President Kennedy to support a tougher civil rights bill. In August 1963, King led one of the largest and most successful demonstrations in U.S. history. About 200,000 blacks and whites took part in the peaceful March on Washington in support of the Civil Rights Bill. The highlight of the demonstration was King's impassioned "I Have a Dream" speech, which appealed for the end of racial prejudice and ended with everyone in the crowd singing, "We shall overcome." Now for the essential question. To what extent was the civil rights movement effective by the time of President Kennedy's death? Make sure you use evidence to support your interpretation.